Yesterday's hail reports out of Lake Crystal, Minnesota tell you something important. Something the brief news segments didn't stop to explain. On April 13th, a chunk of ice roughly the size of a baseball fell from the sky at terminal velocity. And it wasn't falling alone. It was falling alongside at least 14 confirmed tornado reports, damaging wind gusts and heavy rain, all on the same day across Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. One day, one system, 14 tornadoes, baseball-sized hail, and the storm didn't stop. It kept going. April 14th, April 15th, tornadoes in Iowa, tornadoes in Wisconsin, 5 separate tornadoes overnight in Michigan. The Grand River in Michigan crept to within a foot of major flood stage. The Wolf River in Wisconsin pushed past its banks. The Mississippi River basin started climbing. Now, here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. I'm not going to give you a weather report. The news already did that briefly somewhere between the commercial breaks. What I'm going to show you is the underlying architecture of what happened this week across the central United States, and why it connects to things happening simultaneously in Florida, in Hawaii, and across the entire eastern seaboard, because there's a thread running through all of it. And by the time we get to the end of this, that thread is going to change how you look at the beginning. Stay with me. Let's start where it started. The Central Plains. April 13th arrives with a kind of atmospheric setup that meteorologists recognize immediately, and the general public almost never does until it's too late. You need 3 basic ingredients for a violent tornado outbreak: moisture, instability, and wind shear. Moisture surging north out of the Gulf of Mexico, a jet stream positioned just right to provide the upper-level energy, and a dry line or frontal boundary acting as the trigger. On April 13th, all 3 were in alignment across a wide corridor stretching from Kansas up through the upper Midwest. That's not unusual by itself. What made this different was the persistence. The atmospheric pattern didn't reset. It didn't collapse after one round. It just reloaded. That's the word that matters here. Reloaded. The storms on April 13th were severe enough on their own. 14 preliminary tornado reports. Hail up to 3.5 inches in Lake Crystal, Minnesota. 3.3 inches in Denison, also in Minnesota. Those hailstones don't just dent car hoods. They punch through them. They destroy crops at a scale that won't be fully understood until someone actually gets out into the fields and starts looking. And that accounting, by the way, takes weeks. Corn that hasn't emerged yet. Soybeans still in the ground. But the seedbeds themselves, compacted and battered by that kind of impact, suffer real damage. The agricultural implications ripple forward in time, quietly, while the news cycle moves on. But the system wasn't finished. That's the critical point. While emergency managers in Minnesota and Kansas were still fielding calls, still coordinating damage assessment teams, still trying to account for everyone in the path of those April 13th storms, the atmosphere was already spinning up the next round. April 14th, Iowa and Wisconsin. Another confirmed tornado near Union Center, Wisconsin. Structural damage to homes and farms. Outbuildings collapsed. And then overnight, while people are sleeping, 5 more tornadoes touched down in Michigan. EF0 and EF1 designations, yes, which means they're on the lower end of the scale. But don't let that fool you. An EF1 tornado carries winds up to 110 miles per hour. It removes roofs, it picks up cars, it can put people in life-threatening situations if they're in the wrong place at the wrong moment. And these 5 Michigan tornadoes weren't a fresh, isolated event. They were the tail end of a multi-day outbreak that had already been grinding through the region for nearly 48 hours straight. This is where the cumulative stress factor becomes the real story. Emergency services in the central US, first responders, power crews, county emergency managers, they were not working with a full deck by April 14th. They'd already been running hard since the 13th. Communication lines were strained. Mutual aid resources had already been dispatched, and now more calls were coming in. That's the hidden cost of a multi-day outbreak that rarely gets discussed. It's not just the physical damage from any single event. It's the depletion of the human systems designed to respond to that damage. Now, the water. Because this is where it gets complicated. All of that rainfall, and there was significant rainfall accompanying these storm systems, heavy rain overlapping with the hail and the tornadoes, Had to go somewhere. Rain always does. In the upper Midwest in mid-April, the ground is in a transitional state. Snowmelt has already been working its way through the soil profile in many areas for weeks. The ground in parts of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa was already carrying more moisture than it normally would at this time of year. So when several inches of additional precipitation fell over a compressed time frame, the river systems responded accordingly, and they responded fast. The Grand River near Comstock Park in Michigan climbed toward 15.7 feet. Major flood stage there is 16 feet. 1 foot of clearance. The Mio Dam upstream was releasing high flows, which is the standard operational procedure when reservoir levels rise, but it doesn't make the downstream flooding any less damaging. It just distributes it differently. The people downstream from Mio don't get to vote on whether that water comes their way. It's coming. The Wolf River at Shiocton in Wisconsin crossed into flood stage and held above 13 feet through midweek, dropping only slowly. The Wisconsin River in north-central parts of the state was also elevated, and further south, the situation was expanding rather than contracting. The Cedar River in Iowa, the Rock River in Illinois, both approaching or exceeding minor flood stage by April 15th and 16th, as all of that upstream precipitation worked its way through the watershed network and converged on the Mississippi River basin. Here's what I want you to think about. The Mississippi River system is not a single pipe. It's a drainage network for a massive portion of the continent. When you have repeated storm systems dropping heavy rainfall across Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan over a period of days, all of that water is finding its way, creek by creek, tributary by tributary, into the main arteries. By April 15th, the Cedar River and the Rock River were already flagging the trend. The Mississippi itself was beginning to respond. Levees along these river systems were built for specific design flood events. They were engineered with certain assumptions baked in about how often water would reach certain heights and how long it would stay there. When you have repeated multi-day flooding events with inadequate recovery time between them, when the soil never fully drains, when the reservoirs never fully draw down, when the rivers never fully recede before the next pulse of water arrives, those levees are stressed in ways that single event engineering doesn't always account for. That's not an alarm. That's hydrology. That's just how the system behaves under sustained loading. Wisconsin made local emergency declarations. Michigan was dealing with power outages layered on top of flood damage, layered on top of wind damage, layered on top of hail damage. This is what it looks like when a regional emergency response system approaches its operational ceiling. Now, I told you there was a thread connecting all of this to things happening well outside the tornado corridor, and there is. But I'm going to come back to that, because first, you need to understand what was happening simultaneously on the other side of the country, and how the contrast itself tells you something. While Iowa and Wisconsin were underwater and Michigan was counting tornado tracks, the eastern United States was baking, not moderately warm, not unseasonably pleasant. More than 150 daily high temperature records either broken or threatened between April 13th and 16th, highs in the 80s and low 90s across the northeast and mid-Atlantic, temperatures running 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit above their historical averages. That's not a warm day for April. That's a mid-July day arriving 2.5 months early. And this is something worth sitting with. You have simultaneously tornadoes and flooding in the central US and record-breaking heat in the eastern US happening during the same 72-hour window. These aren't unconnected. The same large-scale atmospheric pattern that was driving the severe weather outbreak in the Midwest, that powerful jet stream configuration, that surging Gulf moisture, was also acting as the boundary against which warm air was piling up and accelerating across the east. The two events were, in a real meteorological sense, products of the same parent system. Different symptoms, same underlying cause. The heat across the northeast put immediate strain on our electrical infrastructure. People who weren't expecting to run air conditioning until June were running it in mid-April. That creates sudden, unanticipated spikes in power demand. Utilities that had scheduled maintenance work on transformers and grid components, maintenance that was planned for the quiet spring shoulder season, suddenly found themselves dealing with unexpected load at precisely the wrong moment. It happens every time these early heat events strike, and the consequences can range from minor brownouts to serious outages, depending on the grid's margin. Public health implications are significant as well, particularly for older adults. Elderly populations who hadn't yet had a chance to transition mentally or physically to hot weather, who still had storm windows up, who hadn't yet set up their fans or checked whether their air conditioning units were functional, were suddenly exposed to prolonged heat above 90 degrees Fahrenheit with little warning. That's a real physiological risk that doesn't always generate the same dramatic footage as a tornado, but it carries serious consequences. Down in Florida, the situation was something else entirely. Something that has been building for months, and that most of the national media has been treating as a regional story. More than 1,600 wildfires had burned over 100,000 acres across Florida by mid-April 2026. And the fires were not contained. They were active. Structures were being threatened. Roads were being closed. 80% of Florida was under extreme drought conditions. Not moderate drought, not severe drought. Extreme drought. That's the upper tier of the drought classification system. When 80% of a state the size of Florida is under extreme drought and fire weather conditions, and you have 1,600 individual ignitions, you do not have a fire problem. You have a landscape problem. The fuel, the dry grass, the brush, the palmetto scrub. It's so thoroughly desiccated at this point that any ignition source, a downed power line, a lightning strike, a careless burn, spreads with a speed and ferocity that's almost impossible to contain with standard suppression tactics. And here's the layered pressure this creates. Florida's fires were already drawing on firefighting resources, aerial assets, ground crews, equipment. All of it is finite. The national firefighting system operates as a shared resource pool. When Florida is consuming a large portion of that pool, it means those resources are not available for the next event. And when you also have fire weather watches issuing across portions of the southern plains and the southeast, which was happening simultaneously with wind gusts of 30 to 40 miles per hour and relative humidity dropping below critical thresholds, that resource competition becomes acute. You have multiple theatres of fire activity all demanding pieces of the same finite national response capacity. The southern plains and southeast fire weather watches from April 9th through the 13th represent the kind of background stress that gets lost in the noise when a major tornado outbreak is happening simultaneously. Nobody's talking about the fire weather watch in Oklahoma when there are tornado warnings in Iowa. But those fires start regardless of where the cameras are pointed. Now, Hawaii, Kilauea. On April 9th, Kilauea's summit produced its 44th lava fountaining episode of the current eruption cycle, the 44th. Let that number ground you for a moment. This is not a volcano that experienced a dramatic one-time event. This is a system that has been producing repeated sequential eruptive episodes over an extended period and is showing no indication of exhausting itself. Southerly winds carried the plume across the summit area on April 9th, spreading tephra, volcanic ash and debris, downwind and raising air quality concerns. Aviation in the Hawaiian Islands is particularly sensitive to volcanic plumes. Aircraft engines are not designed to ingest volcanic ash. Even diffuse ash concentrations at altitude can cause significant engine damage, and aviation authorities have to constantly monitor plume trajectories and issue guidance accordingly. For a state that is entirely dependent on air transport, both for its residents and for the tourism economy that keeps it functioning, repeated eruptive episodes create a persistent low-grade operational burden on the aviation system that doesn't generate headlines until something goes wrong. 44 episodes, persistent, ongoing, on US soil. Here's where I'm going to tie the thread together, and if you've been following everything I've laid out over the past several minutes, this is where it changes shape. What you've seen described in this episode is not a collection of separate, unfortunate weather events that happen to occur in the same week. What you're looking at is the simultaneous overloading of multiple regional emergency response systems across the United States at the same time. Tornado response in the upper Midwest, flood management across the Mississippi Basin, heat emergency response in the Northeast, active wildfire suppression across Florida and parts of the southern plains, volcanic monitoring and aviation management in Hawaii, all of it concurrent, all of it drawing on shared resource pools, federal funding, National Guard logistics, FEMA coordination capacity, emergency broadcast and communication infrastructure. The individual events are each manageable, in isolation. Emergency services are built to handle single event situations. That's what the design parameters are based on. But when you stack 5 different types of emergencies across 7 or 8 different states, across a 3 or 4 day window, when Iowa hasn't finished its tornado damage assessment when Michigan's tornadoes start, when Florida's firefighters are already stretched when the Plains Fire weather watches issue, when the Grand River hasn't crested when the Mississippi tributaries start rising, that's when you move from managing emergencies into territory where the management systems themselves begin to show cracks. And that's the real story this week. Not any single tornado, not any single flooded river. The real story is the stress architecture, the way the timing of these events stacks the burden on systems that were built to handle one thing at a time in sequence, not 5 things simultaneously. Multi-day tornado outbreaks are not new to the Central Plains. Midwest flooding in April is not new. Florida wildfires have a history. Kilauea has been active for decades. But the frequency and the simultaneity, the way these events are increasingly arriving in clusters, overlapping, refusing to allow recovery time between impacts, that is the pattern worth watching. That is the signal underneath the noise. The agricultural losses from this outbreak will be calculated slowly over the next several weeks. Farmers surveying hail damage to equipment, to structures, to fields. The infrastructure stress on levees and drainage systems won't show up in the data until the next major precipitation event tests them again. The cumulative fatigue on emergency responders, the ones who ran calls continuously for 3 days across Michigan and Wisconsin, that doesn't appear in any FEMA spreadsheet. And the question of whether this rate of simultaneous multi-hazard loading is becoming the new operational baseline for emergency management in this country. That's a question I haven't heard anyone in the mainstream coverage asking this week. I'm asking it here. If these patterns concern you, if you think the full picture of what happened this week in the central United States and beyond deserves a harder, more sustained look than a 90-second segment between commercials, then this channel is where that kind of analysis happens. Hit subscribe. Leave me a comment below with what I want to know from you. Which part of this outbreak do you think deserves the most scrutiny? The simultaneous multi-state emergency response strain, or the agricultural impact that's going to be invisible to most people until harvest time? I want to know what you're thinking. This is a conversation, not a broadcast. And keep watching these systems. The pattern isn't done. It's never done.